Well, hello, class. Welcome back to another lecture here of church history, our introduction to it. In this particular lesson today, we're going to look at probably a pretty major character in the early church. He cast a very big shadow. His name is Augustine, sometimes called Augustine. He is a man who profoundly shapes Western Christianity, for good or bad, by helping the church think a little more deeply, a little more doctrinally about the subjects of sin, grace, the scriptures, and the role of the church. Some of the ideas that he influenced or that he introduced actually still influence, interestingly, the Catholic Church, Protestant churches, and the Orthodox branches of churches. So he cast a big shadow. We don't necessarily agree with him in all points, but if you're going to know anything about church history, you have to deal with him. In our first 8 lectures, we've watched the church survive persecution. We've watched them defend essential truths, about Christ. In our next stage, we're going to watch the church wrestle not with survival and withstanding persecution. We're going to watch them wrestle with questions about grace, the church, what is authoritative, and what does the Christian life look like? And these questions and the answers shape at least Western Christianity for the next 1,000 years. No single feature or figure would shape these conversations more profoundly than Augustine. If there were no Augustine in church history, Western Christianity would look vastly different. His shadow stretches across Catholic churches, Lutheran churches, Reformed churches, Presbyterian churches, Anglican churches, Baptist churches, Orthodox churches. We learned about Athanasius previously. He helped us answer the question, who is Jesus? Augustine helps us answer the question like, why do we need more grace? How serious is sin? What is the church? And where is history ultimately headed? Previously, we established that Constantine has legalized Christianity. This was 313, his Edict of Milan. Then we talked about the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, and that precisely defines and defends Christ's deity. Survival is no longer the instinct. So the next several questions or next several centuries will allow the church to reflect a little more deeply on, for the first time, systematizing its core doctrinal beliefs. Remember, the Bible isn't written as a systematic theology book. And so now that there's a reprieve and the persecution is over, there's this time to now systematize it. And Augustine brings his great mind into that arena. Let me give you a quick timeline so you can sort of, in your own mind, connect dots and understand where we're at. 313 was the Edict of Milan. Constantine is now giving Christianity a favorable position in the empire. 325, Athanasius defends the deity of Christ. Arius is condemned. We have that Council of Nicaea. 354, Constantine is now moving off the scene, but Augustine is born. 386, he's converted. By 395, he has become a bishop in Africa at the city of Hippo. We know that in 410 is when we typically look at the destruction of the Roman Empire. It's when Rome is sacked by the Goths. Between the time period of 413 to 426, in the context of Rome being destroyed, Augustine writes his most famous work, City of God. And then in 430, Augustine dies. And so as he steps into the world around 354 AD in North Africa, his mother's a devout believer. Her name is Monica. His dad, for the most part, was a pagan who had a deathbed conversion. And this was sort of the home environment in which Augustine was raised. And he didn't originally follow Christ. Instead, he followed the teachings of Manichaeism, sort of like a dualism, like the yin-yang approach. He recounts a story of hearing in a vision the Latin words tolle lege, take, read, in reference to the scriptures. And in his own words later, he providentially turns to Romans 13 and begins to read there. At the age of 31, he became a Christian, baptized by another famous Bishop Ambrose of Milan. 5 years later, he becomes a presbyter, an elder, a priest in the city of Hippo. He wasn't just simply a philosopher writing about abstract theology. He was a pastor. Nearly all of his greatest writings, City of God included, grew out of real problems facing the church. We can take away a quick principle here that God often prepares his servants through long seasons of wandering before he draws them to himself. Augustine's conversion reminds us that no one is beyond the reach of God's grace. So let's look at his life. And I want to just sort of look at it in sort of movements that we can sort of get our minds wrapped around. I want to look at, first of all, in our outline, Augustine and the Donatists. The Donatists were a group of people that were outside of the official Roman church. Were they Baptist? Not identical. One of the things that we have in common with Donatists is their refusal to associate with the established state church. But there's a lot of things that Donatists did that we would not do as Baptists. But there's at least a similarity in that they recognized a free church. And during the Diocletian persecution, remember that, Diocletian 303 AD, some of the church leaders surrendered copies of scriptures to the Roman officials to save themselves. 10 years later, the persecutions ended. Edict of Milan with Constantine is now legal. And the Donatists are asking, can these pastors still be pastors? Have they disqualified themselves because they folded under the pressure of persecution? Most of the Donatists answered, no, they're disqualified. In simple terms, they argue that the church must remain pure and that failed ministers forfeit their authority. And further, baptisms conducted by compromised ministers were now invalid. This concept of an alien baptism. Augustine disagreed. He didn't defend those pastors who compromised. He didn't defend those who had fallen under the persecution. He didn't give a stamp of approval to those who succumbed because of pressure and fear. In fact, he was pretty adamant that they were wrong. His concern, however, was different. Does the validity of God's grace depend on the moral perfection of the minister? He answered no. It doesn't depend upon the moral perfection of ministers. God's promises rest upon Christ and what Christ did. Let's put it in today's vernacular. I think you'll understand a little bit of the situation. I hope it doesn't happen. But let's suppose a faithful pastor that we all respect falls morally. Does that invalidate every baptism he performed? Does it invalidate every Lord's Supper he conducted, every biblical sermon he preached? Does it invalidate those who surrendered to serve the Lord under his preaching? Augustine said no. The minister may fail, but Christ remains faithful. So Augustine is helping the church distinguish between the faithfulness of Christ and the failures of his servants. He's not minimizing their failures. He's just simply arguing that the grace that was imparted through their ministry before they failed isn't invalidated post-failure. Hopefully that makes sense. And this was the controversy he had with the Donatists. Let's walk through, secondly, Augustine's greatest contributions to the church. On the subject of sin and grace, Augustine basically was asking the church to think about how serious is sin. One of the men of his time that he responded to was a man by the name of Pelagius. In responding to him, Augustine argued that humanity is profoundly affected by sin and utterly dependent upon God's grace from beginning to end. That debate became a defining theological conversation in Western Christianity. Later on, it morphs into the conversations of, in theology, synergism versus monergism. And how far do we press the illustration of being dead in trespasses and sins? And Augustine didn't solve all those questions in his days, and Calvin didn't solve it later, and we're not going to solve it today. But we can at least see where it's stemming from. Secondly, his contribution comes in the area of biblical interpretation. How do we read the scriptures? The Old Testament points to Christ. There is a biblical unity between the two testaments because scripture unveils one story about redemption. Augustine didn't want the people to walk away from the Old Testament. Now later, his emphasis on the Old Testament and his emphasis upon Christ caused maybe an overbalance, an out of balance swing, a pendulum swing to the other direction, where people were now reading the New Testament and bringing it back into the Old Testament. I disagree with that principle. I don't believe that we can take all of this theological revelation of the New Testament, read it back in the Old Testament, and say this is what it meant. I believe we have to understand that Revelation is progressive, and we first have to understand the Old Testament as the original hearers would have understood it, and then we can point to the New Testament. So I start with the original revelation and I move forward rather than starting with the final revelation and moving backwards. It's a question of methodology. But at least Augustine, in his favor, at least help people understand we don't just unhitch ourselves, as we've heard in previous days, from the Old Testament. In the area, thirdly, about the church, what gives confidence in the validity of the ordinances? Augustine, he argued that the effectiveness of God's grace doesn't rest upon the perfection of the servants that are involved in the ministry. And we're thankful for that because none of us will be perfect. And as I mentioned before, he was pretty dogmatic that Christ remains faithful even where ministers fail. And we still take confidence in that principle today. Another attribute or another contribution he gave to, we still feel his effect, is in the area of church and Christian worldview. Where is history headed? Rome was a city on a hill in Augustine's days. That's how he interpreted it. So what do you do when the city on a hill is sacked and destroyed and left in ashes? In 410 AD, many believed that Christianity had weakened the empire. And Augustine responded by reminding believers that earthly kingdoms rise and fall, but God's kingdom endures forever. And his work, City of God, became highly influential. Earthly kingdoms will rise, earthly kingdoms will fall, but God's kingdom will remain. History ultimately was marching on. This is where he got people to look forward. History was marching on toward God's purposes and the establishment of his kingdom, and his purposes would not be thwarted. And in the city of God, you can hear echoes of Daniel and Revelation in the background. He also influenced later theology. The medieval church was largely affected by his teachings. In fact, one of the reformers, John Calvin, said, I could write my whole theology from the writings of Augustine. I would say I could write my whole theology from the writings of Scripture, but be that as it may, he said I could write it from the theology and the writings of Augustine. So he didn't minimize the influence that Augustine had upon him. Same was true with Calvin and Luther and Zwingli, many of them taking their cues from Augustine. Many of his conclusions, frankly, can still be discussed today. I don't put a blanket stamp of approval. Augustine said it, that settles it. That's not me. His conclusions can be discussed. Even though we don't recognize him as infallible, we can still, with a heart of gratitude, recognize his contributions. That's all I'm advocating for in church history. Was he perfect? No. Did he reach some conclusions I would disagree with? Absolutely. Will I reach conclusions that you disagree with? Probably so. But can we at least honor someone who helped the church move forward and still disagree in other areas? Sure. And that's the point of this lecture. When he died in 430, his influence didn't end with his death. The theologians beyond him, all the way up to the medieval time period, kept interacting with his writings. Nearly 11 centuries later, Martin Luther, who was an Augustinian monk, would wrestle deeply with his understanding of grace. And in reading some of Augustine's writings on Romans, it sparked the actual conversion of Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation. Calvin would quote Augustine more than any other church father. And so whether or not we agree with Augustine completely, you can't ignore him. Very few figures in church history have been quoted, admired, challenged, and debated as much as him. His influence is so broad that Christians who disagree sharply amongst themselves often find themselves appealing to what he wrote. Orthodox appeal to him, Catholics appeal to him, Protestants appeal to him, Baptists sometimes appeal to him. Augustine's teachings on grace became enormously influential. And about a century after his death, the Council of Orange, this was 529 or so, affirmed many of his convictions about the necessity of grace. They stopped short of his conclusions that some later interpreters would develop from Augustine. We'll return to that council in a later lecture as we talk about medieval theology and how it developed. So, enduring contributions, a biblical defense of grace, a continuing discussion, baptismal regeneration. Enduring contribution, he opposed Pelagianism, that man can't take credit for his salvation. Continuing discussion, he coerced heretics with the sword, and you'll see Calvin do the same. Enduring contribution, a rich theological reflection. Continuing discussion, and pretty fatalistic views on predestination. Enduring contribution, his city of God. Continuing discussion, a growing increase and emphasis on sacramentalism that is going to become fully developed in the church. He's an influential thinker. You'll have to interact with him if you deal with church history prior to the 1800s. If you're going to study church history throughout the generations, you're going to come across his work. The greatest lesson of his life isn't simply the brilliance of his theology. It's the transforming power of God's grace. The young, restless rhetorician became a faithful shepherd because he had an encounter with the risen Christ. His writings, agree with him, disagree with him, they still shape the church. And like every teacher we've studied, Augustine points ultimately beyond himself to the authority of Scripture and to the Lord who gave himself for the church. And so if Augustine has influenced Christians across so many traditions, that should teach us something as ministry leaders about reading church history with not only appreciation, but discernment. That's a quick overview for Augustine. Hopefully that gives you some food for thought. I look forward to seeing you in our next lecture. Until then, God bless.